Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our History Highlight series. Tonight, we will be talking about 1964 and the passing of the Civil Rights Act and civil rights in Dallas, Texas. For tonight's program, I want to thank our community partners, the Communities Foundation of Texas, the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, the Dallas Way, Green Hills School, SMU Human Rights Program, and the Southwest Jewish Congress. Tonight will be a presentation by myself. I am the Senior Director of Education here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I will be joined by our Ackerman Family Director of Education, Latricia Davis. And we're going to head right into it, and I am going to turn it over to Latricia to get started with this history and deep dive into it. At the end, we will take some questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So, Latricia, I'm turning it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Charlotte. Good evening, everyone. Again, thank you to all who are joining us and to our amazing sponsors. We're going to be, as Charlotte said, talking about the 28 days of 1964 of the Civil Rights Act in the Piccadilly Cafeteria. I want to start us with a little historical background. So we're going to start in the nation prior to 1963. The Civil Rights Movement has a long history, one that dates back years, centuries, but truly what we think about as the Civil Rights Movement, and especially in America, begins really to take root in World War II. With the beginning of the war, from the very beginning, the leaders, Black leaders, argue for and demand equality in armed forces and defense jobs, and will finally kind of achieve some of that, at least in defense industries, with A. Philip Randolph's organized march on DC in 1941. But for the most part, and what we think of as kind of the root of modern day Civil Rights Act or Civil Rights Movement of the 60s, the 50s and 60s, we really think about the Double V campaign, this double victory, both against fascism in Europe, but then also for civil rights and against segregation and racism at home in America. We start to see the beginnings of movement towards this, especially socially, in 1947, with Jackie Robinson being named to the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so there's the beginning of social integration. And the true really challenge with legal challenge to segregation begins with legal campaigns against desegregating schools, starting with, of course, the University of Texas Law School in 1950, but truly the kind of groundbreaking legal action of 1954 in the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. It's a series of challenges that are all kind of accumulated into one major court case. It's actually kind of a series of them. But these, and by the end of it in 1954, we see the overturning of the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision that separate but equal is okay. We have the Supreme Court calling for the integration with all deliberate speed. But what is the case and what is the actual outcome is much slower and more resistance, with segregation taking decades, or desegregation and the end of segregation taking decades. Starting examples with schools, 1957, they kind of won a major challenge to it with Little Rock 9, and Governor Orville Faubus in Arkansas challenging the arrival of 9 students, African-American students, to Little Rock High, meeting them with state militia, state guards, and having to be forced to integrate using federal troops, which becomes the trend. The trend is resistance met with federal implementation. We see it again in 1962 with the University of Mississippi, 1963 with the University of Alabama. But this constant challenge of segregation, especially in education. But it doesn't stop with just education. There's, of course, a push to desegregate all segregated spaces, including the famous Montgomery bus boycott that begins in December 1st, 1951, when, of course, Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her seat. Rosa Parks was not new to fighting segregation. She was part of the NAACP in Montgomery. She was an activist and one who worked to ensure the rights and treatment of all for equality and fairness. And so her arrest on December 1st will spark that year-long bus boycott of Montgomery that will eventually see the city caving and agreeing to integrate. This pattern of nonviolent protest really has its roots in the Montgomery bus boycott because it sees the rise of the kind of national figure, if we think about for the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He works with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but with especially his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who work to challenge segregation. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, are student activists that come together to challenge with CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the right to register to vote for African Americans by organizing freedom rides. There's also sit-ins, kneel-ins, of course, the famous sit-in at Woolworth's in 1960 in North Carolina. This continued push continues throughout the 50s and 60s. But what happens in Dallas is a little bit different. So I want to go a little bit kind of side by side. In Dallas, we kind of have our own way. There is, by 1963, the majority kind of legally desegregated, not socially, but legally desegregated, and it's done in a more peaceful manner. This is tied to the kind of leadership of people like Juanita Craft, who Charlotte's going to talk a bit more about in her tie to the Piccadilly Cafeteria protest, but also the mayor of Dallas, among others, who really work to bring people to the table, to bring the white community and white leadership to the bargaining table. That doesn't mean that protests didn't occur. It's just not made on the national scale. We don't see the same violent reactions that we see across much of the South. This desegregation that begins, especially when the mayor comes in 1961, Mayor Cobble begins to meet with leadership, asking about how do we desegregate? What does it mean to desegregate? And begins with education, just as we saw with Brown versus Board. Now, 1961, Dallas had not desegregated a single school on a grand scale. And so we start to see under his leadership, they start with first grade. And then slowly, by the end of his term, all of elementary is desegregated, followed by middle school, and then followed a year later by 1967 with all high schools in Dallas ISD desegregated. It's a slow process, but it's one that's not led by violence. It's not national news. It's just kind of this quiet Dallas way. And Juanita Craft, that example you're going to hear more about, she was kind of at the forefront of this as the leader of the NAACP in Dallas. She was known for organizing protests and pickets. As you can kind of see, one of the biggest places she protested in these images was, of course, the State Fair, where there was one day a year that African Americans could go, known as, with name change, where she begins protesting, the Negro Appeasement Day, which was supposed to be Appreciation Day, but her protest. And you'll notice that there's youth, because these are kids, these are teenagers. She was known for bringing and really organizing the Dallas youth, the Dallas children, to argue for their rights, to argue for the rights of all and the fairness and treatment of all. And so you start to see this. And we see this in Dallas from the 1940s onward. And so by the time we get to really 1961 and 1963 especially, a lot of Dallas has slowly begun to desegregate, but there is still heavy amounts of racism and heavy amounts of tension that will be met with the violence that's occurring. And so 1963, this kind of pivotal year in the civil rights movement. We see in January, and I'll talk about it in a minute, Martin Luther King visiting Dallas, but we have his arrest in Birmingham after a series of protests. And these are, of course, the most famous protests where all of America are seeing dogs and fire hoses, tear gas, branding irons being unleashed on protesters. Martin Luther King Jr. is arrested, and he writes his famous letters from a Birmingham city jail calling for continued push for desegregation, for the rights and fairness of African Americans. The kind of high point of 1963 is, of course, the March on Washington, where 200,000 African Americans and whites march down the National Mall towards the Lincoln Memorial, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivers his I Have a Dream speech. We have, unfortunately, of course, the bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, a reaction to the protest, a reaction to the civil rights movement. All of these actions, and why it's important for our conversation tonight, is that it's really this pivotal year that we see the president at the time, John F. Kennedy, who really begins with to see the need to call for more legislation, not just for kind of the court making a decision and these small movements, but really that the national government needs to start taking a stand. And so we start to see Kennedy call for more legislation, more action by the government. Now, I mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. comes to Dallas. He comes in January of 1963, before his famous speech. His visit is one that is not met with huge welcome. Most of Dallas is very fearful, Dallas leadership, I should say, is very fearful of Martin Luther King Jr. coming because they see he's a galvanizer, he's an organizer, and there's a fear that it will disrupt the balance, the relationship that Dallas has kind of built through that Dallas way of connecting the Black community leadership with the white community leadership to find ways to desegregate. So when it's announced that he's coming, none of the Black churches would host him. He ends up presenting or talking for 45 minutes at Fair Park Music Hall. His talk was disrupted in the beginning by a bomb threat. The building had to be cleared, and the police had to come in. They had to sweep and ensure it was safe. And he speaks on the American dream. Martin Luther King was calling for desegregation, but in a way that it ensured a dream for everyone and a fair dream for everyone. That's not the first time Martin Luther King Jr. had visited. He actually had come to Dallas 7 years before this, meeting with children at a youth church. He'll come again later to speak at SMU. But this was kind of the height. This is the year, the pivotal year. And he ends his speech with something that will be important to our protest to the Piccadilly. He ends his speech by saying, if a man has not found something worth dying for, he isn't fit to live. And that will be a statement that sticks with the audience. To leave it not on such a negative note, he also adds, one can struggle to end the reign of segregation, but yet love the segregationist. Because at his root, he was talking about love, talking about peace, nonviolent protest, but calling for that American dream. Now, that pivotal year of 1963, we start with Martin Luther King Jr. in Dallas. We end with John F. Kennedy visiting Dallas. And as we know, as historians and as Americans, when John F. Kennedy visited Dallas in November of 1963, it was one that he'd been here before to kind of try to organize and court the African-American vote. He's here again in preparation for re-election the next year. But he's also visiting Dallas because he's interested in what's going on. Dallas, especially those that did not agree with Kennedy's call for legislation, for Kennedy's call for pushing for desegregation, there is much that they hate. And you'll see that there's the wanted for treason poster that's kind of publicized across Dallas. When Kennedy is shot in Dallas, shot and killed, it really, for the nation, which has been, remember, Dallas has been kind of hidden. We're not making national news. It really solidifies for many Dallas as this city of hate. That we're a city of hatred because of the stance on segregation, even though Dallas had been quietly desegregating, at least legally and in some places. But there was this stronger push and hatred. Long before Kennedy came, Dallas at one point had the largest number of Klan members. But it really has, in the nation's view, this sense of hate. It is at this pivotal moment that Dallas has this mark, and we start to see that challenge and what really happens. And so I'm going to hand it over to Charlotte, who's going to talk about our major events.
So I get to bring y'all now into 1964. So I kind of want to set, and Latricia's been setting the scene a little bit, right? By talking what has come up all the way to 1963. MLK has come to Dallas. Kennedy has been assassinated. So when 1964 starts, the civil rights movement in Dallas had really come to a pause. Many civil rights leaders felt that, including Kraft and Earl Allen, who I will talk about in just a moment. Sorry, I'm having some struggles with my camera here, which doesn't want to stay on. There we go. Including Reverend Earl Allen, who really didn't feel like right after the Kennedy assassination was the moment to make a big stance on it. Also, when Kennedy was assassinated, talks about a Civil Rights Act were in Congress too, and these discussions had started. And so, with Kennedy being assassinated, a lot changed for the moment. And so by the time May came around of 1964, it was relatively quiet. There was no big sit-ins. There were reorganizations happening again among the civil rights leaders to make sure that also the pathway that had been formed for integration was not fading away in Dallas either, especially with this new label of Dallas being the city of hate. And so I really want to talk about that pivotal moment on May 29, 1964, when a young man walked into the Piccadilly Cafeteria. And the Piccadilly was located on Commerce Street in downtown Dallas. Actually, if you visited our museum, it used to be located just around a little bit around the corner from us on Commerce Street. It's not that far away. Also, not that far away located from where Kennedy was assassinated, which is today Dealey Plaza. So all really in that kind of more almost closer to the west end of Dallas corner of Dallas. The Piccadilly was the southern chain of diners across the South. Actually, the Piccadilly still exists today as a chain, not in Texas anymore. You can still find it in places like Louisiana and Alabama and states there. You can still find Piccadillys today. Latricia, if you wouldn't mind switching to the next slide for me. And so on an afternoon, really, actually on his lunch break, heading out of town, Clarence Broadnax headed to get a lunch bite at the Piccadilly. And there he was stopped and told that he was not to be served there. And I'm actually not going to tell this story. I'm going to let Clarence Broadnax tell you the story himself. And before we play the audio here, I do want to say this is a historical record. This is Clarence Broadnax himself explaining what happened to him the moment he walked into the Piccadilly on that May 29th in 1964. He is going to use dehumanizing and derogatory terms because those were weapons, words used as weapons against him. And so I do want you to be aware of that these terms are going to be used because that's what was used against him. So for the historical record, it's important for him that he accurately portrayed what was said to him, and that's going to be in his testimony as well. So we're just going to take a moment here and listen to Broadnax at that pivotal moment there where he walks into the Piccadilly. Latricia, I'm not sure if we're hearing something. We might have to share with sound. I don't think we're still not hearing anything.
Hold on. Oopsie. No.
Did you share what sound?
I have my sound on. Right, you can hear me, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I don't know why you can't hear the speech. Clarence?
I'm hearing it very faint. I'm still not hearing it, so I'm not
He
sure.
wasn't about to get started.
There we go.
There we go. I got it figured out. Apologies.
Clarence Broadnax, Piccadilly's Cafe Sit-ins, Dallas, Texas, 1964.
There was this restaurant with all kinds of foods, beautiful foods, and I decided that, well, I think I'll have a meal here. And the name of the restaurant was Piccadilly's. After I got in line, the owner approached me and he just outright told me that he didn't serve niggers there and he wasn't about to get started. I figured then, if, as Dr. King said, if a man haven't found anything to die for, he ain't worth living. And I knew that that freedom right there was worth me dying for. So he called the police. The police came. And the police asked me to leave, and I told them I wouldn't go in the place until he decided to serve all citizens. And so they politely told me that if I didn't, I was going to jail. I said, well, I guess I'm going to jail then. They picked me up, took me out, put me in a squad car, and took me to jail. They decided, well, we don't have any charges on this gentleman. So they let me go. And to their surprise, went right back to Piccadilly's. Went right back in, took that seat at the same table. Then by the end, some of the press had gotten there. The word had gotten out. That's where the movement at Piccadilly's got started, and the movement in Dallas got started. So that next morning, I was back at Piccadilly's. And to my surprise, there was about 250 people or more. And he found out real good that it was bad for business. Said, I don't think no restaurants in Dallas had been tested. They had just been sitting there and people were just comfortable and all over, like again, all around them, things were changing.
So I think what you can hear from this testimony is, first of all, that Mr. Broadnax himself was immediately approached by the manager and told, you cannot heat here, you need to leave, you need to go. And then, of course, you used the N-word used against him as well. So it was in a very aggressive way he was approached with that. And it's really important to know that at that point, Mr. Broadnax had not really been a civil rights activist. It's something he cared about, but he had not been part of sit-ins. He had not been part of youth movements at this point. And so it was the words of Dr. King, and this is why Latricia talked about that pivotal moment just a year before when Dr. King was in Dallas, that he remembered those words and realized that freedom was worth dying for. And I think that's such a powerful statement in his testimony in that moment, what he was thinking of, and that moment where he made really that stance to be an upstander for himself, and realizing in that moment, yes, I'm taking a huge risk here, risk of arrest, risk of potentially being hurt. Especially right is watching national news. We've had the bombing happen in Birmingham. All of this together, he knew he was taking quite a bit of a risk with that. What he doesn't know in that moment, though, is that there is a whole movement behind him in Dallas that maybe in that moment is not very active, but that has been. He doesn't have those connections yet with Juanita Crafts, with the Earl Allens or George Allen, these strong civil rights leaders that Latricia talked about previously already. And so he doesn't know that yet. And so when he says it in his testimony, even many years later, right, as Dallas hadn't been tested yet, for him, it is much very new, but it's going to take the support of these civil rights leaders who've been organizing this in Dallas for quite a while. And that's where he said was, right, Ms. Kraft sees this on TV. The next day, there's about 200 people that show up. And that's what happens. The sit-in at the Piccadilly grows with that as well. So Latricia, if you wouldn't mind forwarding to the next slide. Two major civil rights leaders step to the front. That is Juanita Craft. She is going to do basically the rally cry to get more people to show up at the Piccadilly to support Broadnax with it as well. At this point, Craft, as Latricia said, is very much considered one of the leaders of the Dallas civil rights movement. She is very much an organizer, bringing together these youth councils, working with the city council, working with the Congress of Racial Equity, all of these different parts. And she's very much a recognized leader in this. Also, who steps forward is going to be the Reverend Earl Allen, who's the pastor at the Highland Hills Methodist Church, and he's one of the main leaders of this Congress of Racial Equity. He's going to step forward too. And so jointly, with the help from students at SMU as well, they are going to basically rally everybody together to come forward to join in this protest. And this is what I call as the building, right? And it's just these two supporting blocks of this young man who in the moment learns from another upstander, from MLK, this is what I need to do to stand up for myself. And these other upstanders who recognize the power of that young man, recognizing his ability to stand up for himself, to come together, a community coming together to build out this protest. Now, Latricia, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide with that as well. And so this leads to the 28 days sit-in at the Piccadilly, which start on May 29, 1964, and will go in to July. Now, several things happen, and I pulled some images here. Now, these images here are different things. Some of them are surveillance photos because the Dallas Sheriff's Department and the Dallas Police Department were continuously making arrests of these protesters. They will be brought to the judge. They will be released again. They will return. And so these protests were happening day in, day out, all the way through June 27th. They were happening. And usually these civil rights protesters, you can see it on this bigger image in the middle here. They would protest in front of the Piccadilly, but they would also in the little entryway as well. Sit there. They would sing. Oftentimes they would sing "We Shall Overcome" together. They would pray together in it. Throughout this 28-day protest, they also faced counter protests. People walked up with these signs saying integration is a sin against God. Integration is wrong. We should stop integration. Let's remain segregated. Black and white should remain segregated. These big billboards were being marched basically up and down Commerce as well, including the Jay-Z's, this youth group. Both the Dallas Jay-Z's and the Mississippi Jay-Z's actually marched this giant Confederate flag through through Commerce Street past the Piccadilly in counter protest as well. And so it's really important for the sit-in protesters, these upstanders, to stick together, to remain peaceful, and stick to the wording that they had heard the year before from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this is where it's important, is these national connections to that Dallas connections, right? Is these community leaders and these young people coming together to make this possible. Now, the outside world is witnessing this as well, right? Actually, if you come visit our museum, you can sit inside kind of these replica booths of the Piccadilly. You can listen to Mr. Broadnax. You can listen to other civil rights leaders as well, nationwide civil rights leaders too. And you can look at some of these images that I have here as well on the PowerPoint. You can also watch in our exhibit the newsreel that was played on WBAP TV from Fort Worth. And I shared here in my slide actually the document that is the audio that goes with the newsreel. And so this newsreel showed footage on the evening news of what was happening at the Piccadilly. And it's probably a little bit small on your slide here. So I'm going to read this. And again, I'm going to use the language that was used in the newscast. But I think it's important to recognize how in 1964, right, this was being reported on. Now, this was a report from Saturday, May 30th, 1964. And the report goes, diners at the Piccadilly Cafeteria on Commerce Street got a floor show with their meal today. First off, 11 civil rights demonstrators, 8 Negroes, and 3 whites. So it was important to point that out, that both African Americans and white Americans were part of this protest. Now, be aware that this is shows much less, right? We know by May 30th, there's about 200 protesters out there in the sit-in and participating it. So it's showing a lot smaller number. In a little bit in the news report is going to highlight a much larger number as well. And 3 whites asked to be served at the downtown eatery. A representative of the cafeteria chain refuses. The demonstrators say they will hold a sit-in if he doesn't allow them to eat, but the representative remains firm. The demonstrators also remain firm, and they take a position inside the cafeteria's entrance lobby. And we know that that happened, right? They would go sit down, they would sit into the lobby, they would sit outside on the street as well, as we can see here from photos. On the newsreel, you can actually see them sitting in the cafeteria itself, in that little entrance lobby part. A spokesperson for the Dallas Coordinating Committee, so continues the newscast, for civil rights, Clarence Broadnax. So here the broadcasting refers to Broadnax already here as a spokesperson, although we knew in general Alan was actually the spokesperson for the group in general, usually appearing in many. Actually, you can see Alan standing here, I believe, with the white and black hat under the cafeteria sign. We can see him standing in different photos. And actually, if you pull up photos from the Piccadilly, you'll see him in most images in there, as well as you will see Broadnax too. So Broadnax says the sit-in demonstration had been planned for about 2 months. We know that that was not the case, right? We know from Broadnax that this was not planned. This was not a planned sit-in. Actually, at this moment, the civil rights leaders in Dallas were coming back together, but there was not a planned out sit-in. That this was really instigated by the reaction of the manager at the Piccadilly towards Broadnax and him then thinking about that. Broadnax was unable to get into the sit-in group because the large crowd outside the besieged cafeteria. So notice that wording too, as the cafeteria is being besieged by these civil rights sit-in protesters. The demonstrators saying, "We shall overcome." So that's what read and to get with the film footage with it as well. So I encourage you, come visit the museum. You can see there the images together with the newsreel in the exhibit as well. And so it gives you a really good understanding of the power of the community coming together for this, our Dallas civil rights community coming together to support Broadnax, but also the control of people. You can see in this newsreel, people shouting at them, people laughing at them, these signs that are, being passed around, claiming that integration is a sin against God. And meanwhile, they're remaining calm. Even when they are being arrested, they are staying fully calm. They're really nice dressed in their Sunday clothes. You can see it in these images as well, really showing that this is a peaceful protest for respectable citizens that are just asking for basic equal rights, the rights to eat at the Piccadilly. So what happens is that this will continue on, and as the newscaster says, the manager at the Piccadilly keeps firm too. The Piccadilly was not throughout the South integrated, and this is why really it's one of the last big ones in Dallas, in downtown Dallas, to not be integrated either, to remain segregated. So on June 19th, 1964, the Civil Rights Act is actually passed in Congress. And so the momentum is there. We know the Civil Rights Act is going to probably be signed into law. At this point, another Texan who is now president, President Johnson, is likely to sign this. And so this leads the two parties, Earl Allen and Broadnax, to come to the discussion table. And this is kind of that technique that Kraft used, right? Is bring people to the conversation table, to bring to the conversation table with the manager. And that the manager will discuss integration, especially with the background of the passing of potentially of the Civil Rights Act, that he will integrate the Piccadilly and allow them to eat there. And so on June 27th, the demonstrations cease at the Piccadilly with that as well. And Latricia, if you'll go to the next slide. And soon after that, of course, on July 2nd, 60 years from tomorrow, so it'd be a big anniversary tomorrow, the Civil Rights Act is signed into law, as I said, by that other Texan as well. And you can see the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. standing behind him by President Johnson right there. And with that, the sitting at the Piccadilly is officially over. But I'm going to turn it to Latricia because the story really doesn't end there.
All right. So as Charlotte said, the passage of the Civil Rights Act will kind of bring that end to the Piccadilly, and it's officially passed just days after the Piccadilly cafeteria protest ends on July 2nd, 1964. And it will become that most far-reaching civil rights measure we've ever seen enacted. Of course, this began a year before. This act was not just something that LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, comes up with, but it's something that Kennedy actually proposes, introduces the year prior, before his assassination in Dallas in November. And it seeks to, and does, prohibit racial segregation in all public facilities, including hotels and restaurants, which gives that backing that Broadnax needs, that the leadership needs in Dallas to kind of bring that conversation in the cafeteria to protest to an end, because it's now going to be outlawed. In conjunction with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, you also have the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to end desegregation in employment on the basis of race, of religion, of sex or national origin. And as part of this overarching document, this long, far-reaching document, but having those civil rights, ensuring those rights that had been removed after, that were granted with Reconstruction, but removed because of Jim Crow laws in the Jim Crow era, finally enacted, doesn't mean that all still can experience and exercise their freedoms. The Civil Rights Act just ensured that there's desegregation in public spaces, but there was still one thing that this act doesn't fully address. And it's going to take another year to finally kind of bring together all of those desires and those dreams of the civil rights movement, or at least the early part of the civil rights movement. And so this idea that the work was not done, and especially with this idea of voting rights. The Civil Rights Act ensured protection and desegregation of public spaces, but it didn't ensure that fundamental right that we have as Americans, and that's that right to vote. And so you see here citizens being marched because they're marching and protest and push for the ability to register to vote. And so finally, in 1965, we will see the passage of the Voting Rights Act that ensured all citizens the right to vote and authorizes the Attorney General to dispatch federal examiners to register voters, to end those policies that have been implemented since Jim Crow era, the literacy test, the grandfather clause, all things that defrauded citizens of their vote, and it puts an end to those. And of course, we see the protest, the march in Dallas, much more as it was with the Dallas Way, a lot more peaceful, but this also comes after the violence that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others face in that march from Selma to Montgomery, calling for voting rights. And so we kind of see the end, though not really the end of the civil rights movement, but the end of the strong movement and what Broadnax is calling for, just equal rights, really finally passing that 1965 Voting Rights Act. But the work was still not done. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Charlotte for questions.
Hey everyone, well, we invite you to place your questions in the Q&A. So if you please don't use the chat, but if you would use that Q&A button, depending if you're on a tablet or on a computer, if you're on a computer, you're usually using if it's on a tablet, it's on the bottom. Sorry, on the top. If it's on a computer, it's usually on the bottom. And so I have some questions coming in already. The first question is Mr. Broadnax still alive today? Mr. Broadnax is still alive today. He just came in a few months ago to give an updated testimony and walk through the exhibition. So if you're lucky, if you come visit the museum, you might see Mr. Broadnax there as well. The next question is, you have a lunch counter at the museum. Is it from the Piccadilly? No, it is not from the Piccadilly. There's actually very few images of the inside of the Piccadilly. Even the newsreel, it doesn't really show everything. So we kind of base it on, some images that we have of current Piccadillys. And so we kind of create a replica, but it is definitely not an original. It's just for our visitors to kind of have the idea and also a moment to sit down and really take in those testimonies. So be able to sit down, look at the images, and then listen to the voices as you're able to sit down and kind of process all of that. So it is not an original lunch counter with it as well. Also, most of the Piccadilly was booths, so it was a little bit more diner style with that as well. Now, I do hear regularly from people that when they were younger, that they used to go with their families to the Piccadilly. One of our Holocaust survivors, Max Gladwin, always talked that he used to go eat there as well. So maybe some of you ate there as well when you were younger and still lived in Dallas. Somebody asked, how did the word spread about the sit-in? Were the protesters from any particular group? Yes, they were. So the protesters were all linked to these other major civil rights leaders, like Juanita Craft, who had, a vast network of activists who were willing to stand up when she called for it, were willing to do for it. And I think that speaks to the power of Craft herself. Is her ability to bring the community together. She was almost like the mother of Dallas with that as well, and especially in regards to civil rights. Actually, if you have the opportunity, quite frequently at the museum, we have one of our historical speakers is Patricia Perez, used to be part of the Craft Youth Councils, NAAC Youth Councils, and worked closely with Craft. And she always talked about Craft's ability to bring people together and put them for a purpose, a positive purpose together. And that was really her part in the Piccadilly Cafeteria as well, is bring the people together. And Earl Island did the same thing, but more in a visible front leader role as well with that too. Does the building still exist of the Piccadilly? Well, I don't know if it's the original building, but there is a building on 1503 Commerce Street where the Piccadilly used to be located. So the Piccadilly was on 1503 Commerce Street. That's where it used to be located. I'd have to think kind of what is there now. I'd have to walk specifically by it too. But I believe today it's an apartment building. I don't know what's on the bottom level floor at the moment. It used to be a little restaurant there as well. So maybe you can do a stroll through downtown, maybe when it's a little cooler, and go explore it as well. Do you know how Dallas is viewed today? Is Dallas still known as the city of hate? And what does it take to shake that image? But I don't think it took a very long time for Dallas to shake that image of the city of hate and that stamp. Definitely in the 90s, Dallas and the city council really started working on overcoming that and facing some of that history. Of course, as with any city, there's a lot of work still to be done. There's some great organizations in our city, like Remembering Black Dallas, that work towards restoring some of this history and bringing this history to light with it as well. So yes, I think we've kind of rid ourselves a little bit of the stigma of being a city of hate, but I also think there's still a lot of work to be done. Thank you, Lee, for the nice shout out in the exhibit. Ernie is writing, my father, Arthur F. Joe Sr., was a civil rights activist in Texas, particularly in Waco. He met with officials at the Piccadilly headquarters in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and as a result of his efforts, Piccadilly cafeterias were integrated all over the South. Wow, that's amazing. Joe, make sure that that information is recorded. If it's not somewhere, always please, Ernie, reach out to us too. That's so much important history. And I think what Ernie is sharing too about his father is so important to understand is, as Latricia said, there's this very powerful nationwide civil rights movement going on that impacted all of the country, but we had these amazing local civil rights leaders as well, like Ernie's father, Arthur, who is doing this and doing this from Waco, but connecting it all over the South. Craft, who had so much impact with our youth councils. So it's really important to study this local history too and learn from these amazing civil rights upstanders that made a difference. And this is 60 years ago, right? Broadnax is still with us. We can still learn from these people today, ask them questions, talk about them. It's so important right now to think about this history, ask questions, and learn more about it. So I don't see any additional questions coming in. I appreciate everybody joining. Latricia, any final words before we wrap up?
No, again, just thank you to everyone who joined us. We hope you enjoyed the program and really do come learn and hear from Clarence Broadnax himself in the museum, as well as learn about our other upstanders that we have.
Absolutely. Well, we look forward to seeing you in the museum, maybe over this kind of long weekend, 4th of July coming up. Come visit us, come sit in that booth and look at those pictures of the Piccadilly and come see that newsreel as well. And look at all of the other amazing upstanders we have in our exhibition. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I wish you a great rest of your week.